is the lead for all of the St. Louis River area of concern and the projects in Lake Superior area. We have Phil Munson with us as well, and Dan Brenneman, and both Phil and Dan have worked on AOC projects and have had more of a hand in the human health risk assessment, water quality standards and risk assessment. So we have the four of us from PCA here this evening. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And then Melissa Bosman from the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I know I saw your face here earlier. Could you introduce yourself and then the group that you have brought from the Corps of Engineers?
Certainly. Good evening, everybody. My name is Melissa Bosman. I'm the project manager for the Duluth Superior Harbor Maintenance Dredging, and I work out of the Detroit District Office. And I work very closely with Corey Weston. He is our Chief of Construction out of the Duluth area office. Steve Brozart, he's the Duluth area engineer. Monica Anderson, she's the project engineer out of the Duluth area office. Sean Strasser is also a project engineer out of our Duluth area office. Kevin Meyer, he works out of our Detroit district office, and he is works in our environmental analysis branch. He's a biologist. We have Josh Hashi. He is the Chief of Technical Services branch out of the Detroit district. And we have Charlie Ulrich. He is the Chief of our Environmental Analysis branch in the Detroit district. And Joe Kreitinger, he works out of the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center and out of the Environmental Laboratory. He's an environmental toxicologist. I believe that concludes the USACE folks on the call.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Melissa, I think has a nice presentation for us that she's going to start here in a minute. When she's done with her presentation, if the other agencies, the City of Duluth and Seaway Port Authority or the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, if they want to comment on her presentation, that'd be fine. Then we'll follow up with questions from the Erosion and High Water Committee on her presentation and any questions we have for the other agencies. And then after that, we will open it up for public questions and comments. I would ask that the public questions and comments be listed to 3 minutes, because by that time of night, things are going to be getting pretty long. And I think there may be several people that want to get in and ask a question. So let's limit those public comments and questions to 3 minutes. With that, Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Hamilton. Are you guys going to present the presentation here on the Zoom, or I know it was part of the invite that folks can probably pull it up as well? Or how are you planning to share that?
Yeah, Melissa, do you want me to put it up on the screen, or does everyone want to look at the PDF? I sent it to everybody via email today, so it's up to you. If you'd rather see it on the screen or on your own screen, just let me know what you want, Hamilton.
I'm sorry, I muted myself. I would prefer that you put it up, Don.
Okay. So it's the. Thanks for your patience, everyone. I'm not a digital native. I'm a digital dinosaur. My technical assistant will post it shortly. Somehow my desktop is doing something else.
All right, I see it up there.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your patience.
Thank you. All right, well, good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Melissa Bosman. I'm the project manager for the Duluth Superior Harbor Maintenance Dredging, and our team really appreciates the opportunity to participate in the discussion this evening. We're hoping to be able to answer your questions and address your concerns at the end of this presentation. So the next slide, please. I'll begin the presentation with a brief overview of Duluth Superior Harbor and the beneficial use of the dredge material in the harbor. Then I'll provide a summary of the 2020 Maintenance Dredging and Beach Nourishment Project, which will include the dredge areas, placement operations, and the concerns that we heard from the Park Point residents. Then Kevin Meyer will discuss the sediment sampling and characterization, which will include the human health risk assessment. Then I'll discuss the 2021 maintenance dredging project and the proposed beach nourishment. And then we'll open it up for questions at the end. Next slide, please. All right, so Duluth Superior Harbor is the largest port on the Great Lakes with over 35 million tons of material shipped and received in a given year. There are over 18 miles of maintained channels in the Duluth Superior Harbor. You can see them outlined here in yellow. And those are federal navigation project that we're authorized to maintain. So Duluth Superior Harbor is very important to the economy. The Corps dredges approximately 110,000 cubic yards of material each year just to remove the amount of sediment that's coming into the system and keep the harbor open to navigation. And with that responsibility comes the need for suitable placement sites for that dredge material. So we need to continue working with our partners to identify opportunities to beneficially use the dredge material so that we can continue dredging the Duluth Superior Harbor. We're happy to beneficially use our dredge material as long as it's the least cost, environmentally acceptable placement method. Next slide, please. So between 2013 and 2020, through our partnership with local, state, and federal agencies, we were able to beneficially use over 1.1 million cubic yards of our dredge material from the Federal Navigation Channel for critical habitat restoration in the St. Louis River area concern. So the successful beneficial use of dredge material in the Duluth Superior Harbor is truly a model for the Great Lakes. This success is largely due to the HTAC and the outstanding partnership in the Duluth Superior Harbor. They're truly partners that are committed to keeping the channels dredged and using the material to benefit the ecosystem.
Oh, illegal.
So following on the success of beneficially using dredge material for the beach nourishment at the south end of Minnesota Point in 2019, the city of Duluth expressed interest in using the 2020 dredge material to nourish the Minnesota Point shoreline to temporarily restore the eroded beach and dune habitat. So from that point on, the Corps worked closely with our partners to place approximately 49,000 cubic yards of dredge material at the northern end of Minnesota Point. Next slide, please. All right, the next few slides will provide an overview of the 2020 maintenance dredging and beach nourishment project. Overall, the project was a success. However, there were some challenges that we overcame and an unintended consequence that the Corps and our partners are working hard to address. We are using these important lessons learned to mitigate the risk, improve our operations for future beneficial use projects. Next slide, please. So as I previously mentioned, the city expressed interest in beneficially using our dredge material at the north end. And at the point that we had engaged with them, we were about 95% complete with our design. We were planning to take the dredge material from our defined dredge areas down to the south end of Minnesota Point. However, our team got together, we identified the risks associated with changing the placement locations so late in the design. And we determined that we would accept the risks so that we could partner with the community and help mitigate the impacts of the high water and the erosion along the shoreline. So from that point on, we worked very closely with our project partners through the design and construction. As I mentioned previously, the Corps' mission is truly to maintain the navigation in the harbor. However, you'll see on this slide, every partner agency that we worked with, they have their own goals, and that's why we partnered with them so that we could accomplish the 2020 beach nourishment. It could have never happened without that outstanding support from our partners that are listed here. I'd like to also offer a special thanks to the City of Duluth, the MN PCA, the Park Point Community Club, and the Port Authority for your continued support on this project. So moving on to the overview of the beach nourishment project, we awarded the maintenance dredging contract to Rowan Salvage on July 22nd, 2020. The maintenance dredging contract included placement at Minnesota Point and Interstate Island. The contractor began mobilizing on August 4th and the placement operations along Minnesota Point began on August 7th. We placed approximately 49,000 cubic yards of dredge material along Minnesota Point between the breakwater structure, and we extended south just past 9th Street. So placement was complete on September 22nd, 2020, and the contractor mobilized from Minnesota Point and mobilized to Interstate Island. Next slide, please. There you go. So the Corps' first priority is making sure that the critical shoals identified by the shipping industry are dredged to ensure safe navigation of the harbor. And then once those critical shoals are dredged, and if there's still budget available, we'll then focus on maintaining areas of the harbor that we haven't been able to dredge in a long time due to budget constraints. We refer to those areas as non-maintained, and that's just simply they're part of our federal navigation channel. But you know, in years past, there'd been so much material in those maintained channels to dredge that we weren't able to necessarily keep up on those other areas. So we need to keep on strategically dredging these non-maintained areas so that the ships can use these areas as the budget allows us to chip away at these areas. So in 2020, the shipping industry identified 2 priority dredge areas, Area 2 and Area 4. You'll see up here on the slide. And they were in the maintained channel. The shipping industry also requested that we dredge the Duluth area, Anchorage area, which is Area 5, so that they had the ability to anchor in the harbor while they're fully loaded during storms. So you'll see on here, this is the dredge areas that we dredged, and we placed all of that material out on Minnesota Point. We then focused on dredging a portion of the Eastgate Basin with the remaining budget, which I'll go into on the next slide, please. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, with the remaining budget, we were able to dredge a small portion of the Eastgate Basin as well. So this slide shows the areas from the Duluth Anchorage Basin, which are adjacent to the areas that we dredged and placed on Minnesota Point. And these areas here on this side were placed out on Interstate Island. We placed approximately 37,400 cubic yards of material from that Duluth Anchorage area at Interstate, as well as 29,000 cubic yards of material from the Eastgate Basin at Interstate Island in 2020. Next slide, please. The next few slides have photos that were taken pre, during, and post placement on Minnesota Point. So the photo on the left is an aerial view of the nourishment area taken on August 4th before Rowan began their placement operations. And then the photo on the right was taken on August 27th. Materials being built up, and it's been placed up to about 8th Street in that photo. Next slide, please. All right. Here are a couple of photos that were taken during the placement operations in September. You can see the material had been placed and it was spread with a bulldozer. Next slide, please. Finally, here's an aerial photo of the completed beach nourishment area. Photo was taken on 28 September. Photo credits go to Monica Anderson, our project engineer. She was overseeing the contractor out there while they were placing this material. So next, I'll provide a summary of the residents' concerns and our assessment of those concerns. If you wouldn't mind advancing the next slide, please. And one more slide, please. So during the 2020 beach nourishment dredging and placement operations, citizens expressed some concerns about the project. Concerns raised by some of the residents included shredded beverage cans, turbidity, sediment characteristics, odors, oil sheen on the water and sediment surface, and the possibility of an algae bloom. So I'll discuss the Corps' assessment of the shredded beverage cans and turbidity concern, and then I'll hand it over to Kevin Meyer, our biologist, who will present on the sediment characteristics, odor, oil sheen, and possible algae blooms. Next slide, please. Actually, one more after that, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned at the beginning, back one more. Thank you. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we've beneficially used over 1 million cubic yards of dredge material on restoration remediation projects in the Duluth Superior Harbor, and we've never encountered debris in those dredge areas. However, as everyone on this call is likely aware, during the 2020 dredging operations, we believe that our contractor encountered some old beverage cans in the dredge area and inadvertently placed them on Minnesota Point. This was much of a surprise to the Corps, as I'm sure it was to the community. The Corps does take this issue extremely seriously, and we're working very hard to improve our dredging and placement operations to mitigate the risk of this happening on future projects. So after further reviewing the information provided by the residents, our monitoring of the post-placement site, and we reviewed the daily dredging and placement reports, we believe that those old cans likely were encountered in area 5F, and you'll see that up on the slide. The Duluth Anchorage Basin hasn't been dredged in several decades, so we believe that the cans were likely discarded from a ship that was anchoring in the basin back when that basin was deep enough to use. By that material interstate, and no cans were found in that material either. Therefore, we were concluding that the cans were likely encountered in that dredge area 5F just by looking at the sequence of the dredging and the placement and what we're finding when we go out there on site. So since then, our project engineer has been monitoring the placement site and collecting any debris found. And that was since we were made aware of this issue. The members of the Park Point Community Club have also been monitoring the placement site and collecting the shredded cans as well, and the Corps very much appreciates the support. Although monitoring efforts have temporarily stopped due to the snow and ice on the beach, the need for additional monitoring and cleanup will continue to be evaluated through the winter and spring and will continue as needed based on the amount of debris that is observed and as the weather conditions allow. Please check the Park Point Community Club webpage for updates on the monitoring and cleanup efforts. So the next slide that I'll go into illustrates the types of debris that we found on Minnesota Point within and just south of the nourishment area. So this slide, I think, provides a pretty good representation of the types of trash that, namely, our project engineer found while they were out on site on a couple of their monitoring efforts. So the primary types of trash encountered along the beach appear to be modern day trash. However, we're also finding shredded pieces of old cans as well, which you'll notice at the top of these photos. So she did a really good job of kind of organizing the debris that we believe to be the shredded cans from our placement operations. And then you'll see the more modern day trash that we believe just was either placed there by folks visiting the beach or it washed up. So we do understand the community's concern, and we are working hard to mitigate the risks of this happening again. We've been working with the marine contractors to determine feasible screening mechanisms on the equipment, as well as updating our plans and specifications, which will require our contractors to submit a debris monitoring and cleanup plan for our review and approval. The contractor will also be held responsible for monitoring and cleaning up any man-made debris generated by the dredging and placement operations, should that occur in future placement projects. So I'll go on to the next slide, please. All right, during 2020 placement operations, we also received concerns about elevated turbidity resulting from our placement operations on Minnesota Point. So I'd like to take a few minutes to address this concern on the following slides, please. Right. So to ensure placement operations are compliant with the state of Minnesota water quality standards, our USACE Engineer Research and Development Center developed several best management practices for managing the turbidity during placement operations. So the BMPs were developed with an understanding of the nearshore hydrodynamics of Lake Superior, sediment characteristics of the dredge material, and placement equipment and methods used by our contractors. The horizontal discharge pipe with a baffle plate and the reduced production rate are two of the principal BMPs that are most effective at minimizing the turbidity during placement operations. A slower production rate decreases the rate of resuspended fines production, and it allows for of a greater dilution of the total suspended solids. Other BMPs used during 2020 beach nourishment operations were onshore placement of dredge material and placing the dredge material such that the fill progresses from the foreshore and slopes lakeward. This is a photo of the material being discharged from a horizontal pipe with a baffle plate at the end. The material is being placed onshore, which reduces the stripping of fines from the high velocity discharge that you see here. So the contractor in the Duluth area office project engineer visually monitored the turbidity levels, weather and wave conditions to help ensure that the BMPs were correctly deployed and functioning as intended during our placement operations. Also, during our placement operations, our staff followed the turbidity daily inspection procedures. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we received some concerns regarding the turbidity, and while we agree with the residents that they were very likely seeing increased turbidity, that doesn't mean that, that it's a violation of the water quality standards. Here's the project area that we developed with our research engineer during the BMP development. This is the area that we expect to see temporary exceedances in turbidity during the placement operations. So temporarily exceeding turbidity within the project limits that you see here is necessary to accomplish the beach nourishment operations. The project area is developed and proposed by USACE as part of our annual BMP coordination with the MPCA. The MPCA provides final approval of the BMPs to include the project area. Both agencies acknowledge that there will be temporary exceedances from the nourishment operations within the project area that you see here. The next few slides contain photos that were taken of the nourishment area when we were notified about the turbidity concerns. So this first slide, this illustrates the different sources of turbidity. So the turbidity in the harbor from a large rainfall event looks very different than the turbidity from placement operations. And I thought this photo did a good job of kind of showing that. That was during our placement. You can see kind of the, I don't know, the rounded area where we're placing out by the breakwater. And then you can see inside the harbor, it was taken right after a large rainfall event. So I thought that was a good distinction between the two types of turbidity that you'll see. Next slide, please. So next few slides will be photos that we took from the roof of our area office after we received the turbidity concern on 14 September 2020. It was 8 days before we completed placement, and you can see kind of in the waves, the color change in the surf. You can kind of see where that turbidity ends, where the white waves are in that photo. Next slide, please. So again, here you can see the turbidity coming out of the ship canal, and you can also see the turbidity resulting from our placement operations. Note that the turbidity doesn't go past the end of the pier, which is well within our placement area that was coordinated with the MPCA. Next slide, please. Here's another photo that was taken just after a ship exited the harbor. You can kind of see the eddies at the top of the picture where the ship went through. And you can also see, again, right adjacent to that ship canal where we're placing, and you can see that increased turbidity. So it's two very different looks to that turbidity. So next, I'll hand the presentation over to Kevin Meyer, our district biologist, to kind of walk through the following concerns: the odor and oil sheen, and then the algae bloom, and then he'll move into the sediment characteristics and sediment sampling discussion.
That's pretty much as loud as it gets. All right, thank you, Melissa. We can go to the next slide, please. As she said, I'm Kevin Meyer. I'm a biologist out of the Detroit office in the environmental analysis branch. I'm going to walk through some of the other concerns that were raised by the citizens on the point, as well as discuss the sediment sampling characterization that the Army Corps does for all dredging operations. Next slide, please.
You've got.
All right. So there was a concern raised about odors coming off the beach during placement operations. And to understand where some of these odors could originate, I would like to discuss where organic matter can be found in natural estuaries like the St. Louis River estuary. So most aquatic ecosystems have a high amount of organic matter, and that occurs naturally from sources such as algae and vegetation, dead organisms sinking to the bottom and decaying, and fecal matter from organisms like fish, mammals, and other sources. There can also be unnatural sources of organic matter introduced to ecosystems such as this, and you'll find that from things like petroleum sources or industrial waste. And both of these sources are sources that the Army Corps actually samples for in its sediment characterization of the harbors. However, any organic sources found in an aquatic ecosystem interact with biological processes. And so things like decay of dead organisms, decay of that vegetation and other algal matter that accumulates in these systems naturally occurs on a regular basis. And microbes are the ones that actually drive most of these processes. And there's a very fascinating diversity of bacteria that actually use different components and different sources to generate energy from these biological processes. And some of these sources actually use very interesting compounds and interesting chemistries to fuel their own biology. And so there are microbes that actually use iron and sulfur as oxidation sources for their own energy generation. And as a result, many of these bacteria produce some very odorous or smelly compounds that when exposed to the natural air or exposed to our lungs are very potent and very smelly. But these are actually from natural processes that are occurring within the sediments on a regular basis. It's just that most of us don't normally spend our time in a swamp or buried in sediment where these bacteria normally live. And so it's not a normal thing that we're used to experiencing. And on the left here, you can see a table of sediment samples that we actually analyzed for total organic carbon during the placement in 2019 on southern Minnesota Point. And what this is demonstrating is on the top row in the placement area, we actually see a large kind of pulse of organic carbon that occurred during placement. So that was organic carbon found in the dredged sediment that was therefore transported by the dredging operation to the placement site, so the beach itself. Over time, many of those organic particles and the fine material that they're typically associated with naturally decay or are washed out to deeper waters. So before we placed any material there wasn't a lot of organic carbon on the beach itself. The placement operation introduced some of that organic carbon from the estuary as part of the dredging operation. And then over time, through natural processes and through physical processes, that organic matter was carried offshore. Next slide, please. And to illustrate the diversity and how some of these microbes actually are, how they look in that environment, here are some great photos, one of which was provided by someone along the point. When some of these microbes actually are seen to the visible eye, they actually appear very oily and create a sheen. So in the lower left, this is a photo from Lake Huron, and this is a deep hole that is over a sulfur vent. And what you're seeing is not sand in those white patches. It's actually a white sulfur bacteria, and the darker spots is a purple sulfur bacteria rather. And you can see that there's actually some little like fingers sticking up, and that's actually sulfur bacteria that are using sulfur compounds to produce gases that is actually pulling the mat off the floor. And when those mats come to the surface, they're very oily looking, and they actually form these kind of sheens that look very much like an oil slick. In the lower right, we actually have an iron oxidizing bacteria. A lot of rivers and upland systems have these iron oxidizing bacteria. And once again, you can see that they also have a very oil-like sheen when visible on the surface. One way that you could further investigate, if you're interested, is actually trying to break up these sheens, because these bacteria will actually not naturally reform into that clump. So that's one way that if you do encounter something like an oil sheen in the surface, you can determine whether or not it's actually a petroleum source, because the oil sheen will actually reform if you disturb it, or if it is one of these very fascinating microbes that will stay broken up once you disturb it. If it is a petroleum source or a true oil sheen, that is something that the Army Corps would be very interested in knowing, because then we need to take corrective mitigation actions. Next slide, please. Another concern that was raised was the potential that there was oil slicks or actual oil particles on the beach. And what I'm showing here are actually two samples from the same dredge area that was placed on Minnesota Point in 2020. And both of them were from this green box, which was that area, I believe it was 5F. And these two samples were not that far apart, but you can see in the top photos, they have slightly different color. And the bottom photo is, I think, much more illustrative, that they have a very different texture. And these are samples from very close to one another. And so when samples that have a different gradation of the size of sediments, as well as the color to them, get introduced into a natural beach system, those sediments are naturally going to separate and clump together, or be moved around by the wave action. So in a lot of cases, you'll see almost like those lines, those ripple effects on the beach, which is natural wave action actually separating these different particles into groupings based on their size, their buoyancy, and other physical properties. Next slide, please. Of particular concern were actually sediments that appeared black in appearance, and there was a concern that they were actually oil particles or oil droplets. And so here is actually a core. The entirety of the core took two pictures that was taken from the harbor itself. And you can see through this core itself, it goes from lighter at the top to darker to almost black in parts. And that blackness actually occurs from lack of oxygen in the sediment. So some of these microbes are not used to an environment where oxygen is readily available. And as a result, you will see processes from the chemistry and the organisms themselves that actually turns the soil almost black or very dark in nature. When those soils are introduced to the beach, they still retain some of that color for quite some time. And so while it may look like oil or other petroleum products, most likely it's going to be these anoxic or oxygen deprived sediments that are still black in nature, that were removed from the bottom of the harbor as a result of dredging operations. Next slide, please. All right. Another concern that was brought up is one that is very fascinating to me, and that is an algal bloom. Next slide, please. And to first start the discussion about algal blooms, I think it's important to understand what a true algal bloom is. And an algal bloom is a very high concentration of algae in the environment. True algal blooms are often visible to the naked eye, even at great distances, as seen in the satellite photo where you can see a large algal bloom in Western Lake Erie from space. Right. There is a subset of algal blooms that are classified as harmful algal blooms, or HABs. These algal blooms have secondary effects to the environment that are negative in nature. So they either shade other photosynthetic organisms from the sun, so they're no longer able to grow. They choke out either the gills of fish or other animals by taking all the oxygen in the environment, or in some cases, they can produce compounds that are toxic to humans. So those are a subset of algal blooms. Not all algal blooms are bad, but some can be. And some of those effects are ones that are closely studied by the scientific community. And in some cases, as in Lake Erie, we actually put out a forecast, or NOAA puts out a forecast rather, warning people whether or not a harmful algal bloom is occurring. So algal blooms do occur naturally in the Great Lakes, and some of those algal blooms are influenced by humans. But that influence primarily comes from excessive nutrients being put into the aquatic system, and those nutrients are used by the algae to obtain this large amount of biomass in that concentrated area. So it's basically, we're fertilizing these blooms, they're taking up all these nutrients, and they're growing like crazy. Physical conditions in the environment also can help or hinder blooms. In many cases, in freshwater systems, you need a very high temperature so that these algae can grow very quickly. You need very calm conditions because waves will disrupt or break apart these blooms or potentially the cells themselves. And you also need a large rainfall or outflow event prior to the bloom that brings all those nutrients from upland out into this system. So you need a source of those nutrients, you need a rainfall or other event to bring those nutrients out into the system itself, and then you need calm, high temperature water to allow these blooms to occur. The Army Corps of Engineers has studied potential links between dredging and bloom dynamics in Lake Erie and was not able to find any significant links between the dredging operation and the blooms themselves. Next slide, please. There have been blooms of the cyanobacteria Delicospermum lemmermanii observed in Lake Superior. That's what's pictured here. You can see that nice high concentration of algae that's a hallmark of algal blooms. The last one was observed in 2018, and it was along the southern shore of Lake Superior. There was a research group that specifically looked at these bloom events to determine what could have been the primary driver behind these blooms. And while they found that this Delicospermum species was found in Duluth Superior Harbor, it was not a dominant species. What they did find was that most of these cyanobacteria were actually coming from rivers along the southern shore. But in these 2 years, the physical conditions along the southern shore really played a dominant role in the development of these blooms. So there were large rainfall outflow events, as discussed previously. Those events brought lots of nutrients to the southern Lake Superior system, and the water was unusually warm in that time of year. So looking at all these conditions that are typically required to see large algal blooms, we did not observe these same conditions in Lake Superior during dredging operations. While it was observed that there were some clumps of cyanobacteria, most likely, it was not a high enough concentration to indicate an algal bloom was occurring, nor were the physical conditions such that a large bloom would persist. Next slide, please. Just to help you understand how we're able to come to some of these conclusions, I'd like to give an overview of the sediment sampling that the Army Corps conducts in the Federal Navigation Channel and how we use that information to best inform dredging operations. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of how I'm going to present the sediment sampling is I'm first going to go over some of the guidelines and regulations that the Army Corps uses to inform how we conduct sampling. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the distribution and timing of sampling that occurs in Duluth Superior Harbor. And then I'm going to get into some actual specifics about dredging in 2019, how those samples were used to inform a human health risk assessment, and then how that information was also used in 2020 to inform the dredge placement that occurred on northern Minnesota Point. Next slide, please. So the dredge sampling that occurs by the Army Corps is not done in a vacuum, and actually there are several regulations that dictate how we need to conduct sampling and how often we should update or what metrics and regulations we need to follow when conducting sampling. So at the top, we have our basic guidance that the district engineer needs to basically use the most updated version of testing appropriate for the dredge material in question. In the case of Duluth Superior Harbor, our go-to manual is the Great Lakes Dredge Material Testing and Evaluation Manual. And then we also use the Evaluation of Dredge Material Proposed for Discharge of Waters of the U.S. Testing Manual. And so these are two different manuals that tell us how we should conduct our testing, how we should evaluate it, and how we should evaluate specifically if we're considering discharging it back into the water. Right. For the Duluth Superior Harbor, we also coordinated with the state of Minnesota and the state of Wisconsin to develop a quality assurance program plan for the St. Louis River area of concern. And so this was additional guidance and regulations that were developed specifically to try to meet the objectives of the St. Louis River area of concern program. And this is in order to remove beneficial use impairments that occur within the Duluth Superior Harbor and surrounding ecosystems. Next slide, please. All right, so all that different guidance and regulation packaged together, how we actually conduct the sampling is first, we separate the harbor into what we call dredge material management units. These are basically lines on a map that represent particular components or sections of the navigational harbor that we use to further subdivide the harbor for the sampling itself. These units are based on the approximate quantity of material contained within them. So they are going to be different sizes and shapes, but each of them has about 50,000 cubic yards of material contained within them, or about 50,000 cubic yards of material that we're intent on sampling. Of those DMMUs, we typically have 5 samples, or a minimum of 5 samples within each of those DMMUs. And below you see that we have a laundry list of things that we test for in each of those samples. Because of the amount of time that it takes to not only divide the harbor into the DMMUs, determine where those samples are going to be taken, take the samples themselves, send them to the laboratory, get them analyzed, quality control the results, and then review, verify, and present the results, it takes typically about 2 years to conduct an entire sampling regimen. As such, the Army Corps of Engineers typically resamples the harbor on a 3 to 5 year cycle. Next slide, please. To give you an idea what the DMMUs look like, here is the outer harbor, and you can see the different lines breaking the harbor into different sections, and each of these represent a DMMU. Next slide, please. Overlaid on the DMMUs now, you can see these are samples that have occurred within the past 2 sampling cycles in the outer harbor alone. And you can see that some of those DMMUs have more than 5 samples taken from in them, and there's a lot of overlap. I just wanted to give you an idea of the amount and coverage of samples that occurs within the harbor as part of the Army Corps sampling program. Next slide, please. All right. I'm now going to present a little bit of information about how we used the harbor sampling to inform placement of sediment on Minnesota Point, southern Minnesota Point in 2019, and how we further investigated those sediments using a human health risk assessment. Next slide, please. So the red boxes overlaid here are the actual areas that we dredged in 2019 and placed in the blue area there of southern Minnesota Point, just to give you an idea of where we are dredging and how it overlapped with the DMMUs. So how the Army Corps approaches this is that we look at the areas that we are going to be dredging, and then we try to collate all samples taken from any dredge material management unit that overlaps that dredge box. So if a dredge box falls across multiple DMMUs, we will look at all samples from all DMMUs that that dredge area covers. This allows us to better characterize the sediment and have a higher statistical rigor behind how we analyze and evaluate the sediment. So in the case of that red area in the, towards the top, you'll see that it crosses the boundary of 3 DMMUs. So we will have used the samples from all 3 DMMUs in our evaluation of the materials from that particular dredge area. Next slide, please. Before placement began in 2019, we presented an evaluation and assessment of the sediments from the dredge areas that we are going to be dredging in 2019 to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency as part of our typical coordination and best management practice discussions with the MPCA. They raised a concern that there were additional contaminants, specifically dioxins and furans, within the dredge areas presented for 2019. As such, they requested Can you hear me again?
You're muted.
Yeah, I don't know how. I just got a message that the host muted me accidentally. I apologize. So I'll back up. So in 2019, when we presented our findings from the harbor sampling to the MPCA, they raised a concern that there were additional contaminants that had a potential risk to human health. They requested that the Army Corps to conduct a study to determine if these potential contaminants of concern, called dioxins and furans, were a risk to human health. We proposed that we would conduct an additional sampling event of the placement operation and develop a human health risk assessment. What that involves is actually identifying how people on the beach could become exposed to a potential contaminant, developing a risk-based screening level that would be protective of human health. So developing basically a system to determine whether or not a potential exposure is actually a risk or a harm to human health. And this was developed using methods both from the state of Minnesota as well as United States Environmental Protection Agency. And then the last step of that risk assessment is to actually evaluate the sediment itself against that risk-based screening level to determine if that potential contaminant of concern is present at a concentration that would be a potential risk to human health. In this particular instance, we conducted 3 particular sampling events of the placement area. One before any sediments were placed. So this was to ensure that there were no contaminants already present and to set a baseline. One during the placement operations. And so this was to see what was actually coming out of our dredge pipeline. And then one after the winter season to determine how those sediments that were placed were weathered over time. Next slide, please. All right, human health risk assessment. One thing that we want to make sure that we are is very conservative. And by conservative, I mean we are trying to maximize the safety by assuming that there's going to be essentially a maximum exposure and the lowest amount of exposure that would produce a toxic result. So in this case, our toxicologists and risk assessors developed an exposure scenario where a beachgoer's head, full bare arms, full bare legs, bare feet would be exposed to placed dredge material sediment 5 days a week for 21 weeks each year over a period of 26 years. This exposure also included incidental ingestion of the sediment. So this is assuming that you're going to the beach, you're actually getting in that material, you're exposing your skin, potentially ingesting or eating or inhaling some of that material 5 days a week, most of the summer season for 26 years. We also looked at all chemicals that can contribute to this dioxin-like toxicity. So not just dioxins and furans, but other chemicals that could act similar to them and therefore also contribute to toxicity. And to make sure that we are being conservative, we only looked at samples from the actual placement area so that samples outside the placement area where there were no potential contaminants wouldn't lower the exposure level itself. What we found was that the concentrations of contaminants of concern in placed sediments were actually 100 times lower than levels that were considered protective of beach users. This includes residents and children. So our safety screening level that we came up with through this exposure scenario and looking at all the toxicology data was an exposure of 4.7 nanograms per kilogram of dioxins. In May of 2020, so after a winter season working those sediments, the level of dioxins measured in the sediment was 0.05 nanograms per kilogram. Over the entire course of sampling, we saw a range of dioxins of 0.01 to 0.41 nanograms per kilogram. So our maximum detected concentration was still 10 times lower than a safe screening level for the exposure scenario outlined above. So this just shows that we used multiple lines of evidence with a very conservative estimate to maximize safety when assessing dredge sediments for a potential human health risk. Next slide, please. All right. So how did this help us inform the 2020 sediment placement on northern Minnesota Point? Next slide, please. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is that these are the dredge areas used in the northern Minnesota Point sediment placement, as Melissa presented earlier. These DMMUs are overlapping the same DMMUs that were used in the 2019 sediment placement and human health risk assessment. So the first step that we always do is we look at where we're dredging, what samples we have from those dredge areas. In this case, we had the exact same samples that we were using in our 2019 evaluation to evaluate the 2020 dredge samples. So all the dredge areas were overlapping. So we were using the same pool of samples to evaluate the sediment in the same manner. So everything that informed our 2019 placement and the evaluation we did of the beach placed sediments in 2019 was almost a carbon copy for 2020 because we're going from the same dredge areas, or the same DMMUs rather, and we're using the same pool of samples to evaluate those sediments. What I have presented here is just the size classifications of the various sediments. And you can see that there are some differences across the harbor in terms of the amount of sands, the amount of fines. And that, what is it, area 5, A, B, and C, or A, B, and D rather, were the ones that went to Interstate Island. And approximately half of that material went to Minnesota Point. So the main takeaway here though is that the first step is always to make sure that we have sufficient sampling in place. Look at what samples we have from the DMMUs that overlap our dredge boxes, and then evaluate those samples based on all the laboratory analysis. In the case of 2020, we also had additional data from the human health risk assessment that could further inform the safety and suitability of that material for placement. Next slide, please. All right, so I think this is a nice overview slide of everything that we know about sediment characterization for Duluth Superior Harbor, and is a good, I think, go-to to refresh yourself if you have any questions in the future about how we conduct our sediment characterization and what we specifically did in 2019 and 2020. So what do we know about sediments in the Federal Navigation Channel? We sample throughout the channel every 3 to 5 years, and that's both in the maintained and non-maintained areas. Each sample roughly represents about 10,000 cubic yards of material, and we analyze those samples for potential contaminants and physical characteristics. Any materials that are found to exceed water quality standards or otherwise deemed unacceptable for restoration projects or in-water placement are taken to a confined disposal facility for disposal and additional treatment. So only if it's of the highest standard for in-water placement or restoration projects would it even be considered for placement anywhere in the harbor or on a beach. What do we know about sediments that were placed on the beach? Well, as I just said, the material either met or will meet water quality standards for in-water placement. Further, any material placed in a beach environment will be eroded and reworked by normal processes, winter storms, wave events, with the fine material being transported to deeper waters. How did the MPCA and USACE confirm that sediment are not a risk to recreational and residential users of the beach? In 2019, we did additional sampling of placed material on the beach against a human-based risk screening level. We found that the beach sediments had concentrations of particular contaminant of concern, dioxins and furans, that were 100 times lower than the screening value considered safe 5 months after placement. It was also 10 times lower than the risk screening value immediately during placement operations. We used data from the navigation channel sampling in 2019 and 2019 placement monitoring to inform the 2020 placement. It underwent the same evaluation that we did for the 2019 before we placed the samples, and then we used that additional human health risk assessment information to inform the 2020 placement. Why do some sediments have an odor or smell when placed on the beach? Estuarine environments naturally produce or contain organic matter, and that organic matter, when broken down, can release sulfur compounds, iron oxides, other things that have a particular odor or smell that is not pleasant. In addition to that, the Army Corps samples for oil, grease, and other petroleum-based products to make sure that there is no petrochemical contamination in a particular dredge material management unit. If there is, it would not be considered suitable for in-water placement. Did the dredge material contribute to an algal bloom? Algal colonies were observed at the placement site, but not at a density considered to be a bloom, and therefore not likely to be harmful or toxic. There are conditions in Lake Superior that would allow for algal blooms to form, but during placement operations in 2020, conditions did not exist that would be conducive for an algal bloom to form or persist. And lastly, how does the Army Corps address debris and sediment? As Melissa mentioned, we will be working with contractors to identify effective mechanisms to screen dredge material. We'll be adding contract requirements to inspect site and clean up the debris during and after placement. And we will further require that contractors submit a plan for monitoring for debris generated and cleaning up any debris generated during placement operations. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa to discuss the 2020 potential dredge placement. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. So the next few slides, I'll provide a summary of the 2021 maintenance charging priority areas and proposed beach nourishment. Next slide, please. All right. So we met with the shipping industry in early December to review the condition surveys and identify critical shoals that need to be dredged in 2021. Overall, the shipping industry identified 2 critical shoals. So we'll be able to continue addressing portions of the non-maintained areas within the harbor with the remaining budget that we have in 2021. So there's a shoal in the Duluth Ship Canal right out there in the outer flare that was identified by the shippers as a priority. There's approximately 7,500 cubic yards of material out there. It consists of approximately 99.9% sand. So that's one dredge area. Next slide, please. The other priority dredge area identified by the shipping industry is a small shoal near the Superior Basin. It's approximately 700 cubic yards of material. Material consists of about 86% sand and approximately 14% fines. Next slide, please. So we worked with our chemist to evaluate the sediment data and identify non-maintained areas of the harbor that would be suitable for beach nourishment and is not likely to contain debris. So the area of the Eastgate Basin shown in the white box, it was a borrow area for the Wisconsin Piping Plover project in 2019. The contractor removed the top 5 feet of the sediment from this area to create that piping plover habitat. So we believe that there's a very low chance of encountering debris in that material that lies below that 5-foot cut that was taken off. So we're proposing to dredge that material from that area and place it on Minnesota Point. The average grain size distribution for that material is it's greater than 94%. And that's if you were to factor in that top layer. And when you look at just the bottom, we call it B layer, C layer, D layer, it's more around 97% sand. Another thing to mention is that the material from the Eastgate Basin that also went to 2020 Interstate Island Turn Nesting Project, that material was right in that area, and our partners were very happy with the quality of that material, and we didn't find any cans in that material either. Next slide, please. So we're proposing to place approximately 100,000 cubic yards of material beginning where the placement left off in 2020 and extending south to the S-curve. Our goal is to award the contract in early to mid-June so the contractor can begin placing the material in early July. We anticipate that the dredging and placement operations would be complete by the end of September 2021. We understand that the summer season is very short in Duluth and the residents in the nourishment area will be impacted by the operations. However, we're asking you guys just to consider the benefits of getting the 100,000 cubic yards of material out there placed along that eroded shoreline. We really appreciate the continued support from the community and our partners on the Beach Nourishment Project. And this concludes our presentation. So now I'd like to hand it back over to Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Melissa and Kevin. That was very informative. I would open it up now to our other strategic partners. If the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, anybody from there would like to make some comments before we go into the question period. Anna, you or any of your folks have any comments to make? Any additions?
I think that covered the project pretty well. We're certainly happy to field any questions, but I, again, just want to echo some of the things that Melissa said about the fact that, it's been very important for us to work with all the project partners on this, understanding that different agencies have different goals and different requirements for what it is that we do. And so this has been a really good collaborative relationship. So I want to thank everybody that has participated throughout. And yeah, if there are questions, we're certainly happy to answer them. And I'll just give a moment if there's anything that anybody else from PCA did want to add at this point.
Yeah, Kevin Malloy here. I was a project manager for the 401 certification along Minnesota Point here. And just one additional thing to remind the group of is our original authorization for this project up and down Minnesota Point. It's called a 401 certification, and that was put out on public notice. I remember a few of us met with some of the people connected to this call back in early 2019, and a similar discussion of like what we're having now. And so that was just before the draft 401 certification was placed on public notice. And the actual authorization that was issued to the Corps is for 5 years of placement at wherever the need is in a given year. So the first year in 2019, it was placed closer to the Superior entry. And then last year, everybody on this call knows where it was placed. And so Melissa just had a presentation, the slide showing where they're proposing to place it for this year. So just wanted to let you know it's not required to go out on a public notice at each subsequent year, but the Corps has to give us the details on the characterizations of the sediment and how much of it from which location and the accompanied BMPs so that we can limit the turbidity to the extent possible for this project that is well intended to prevent erosion. So thank you. And I apologize too, I don't have a webcam.
Thanks, Kevin. Dan or Phil, if you have anything that you'd like to add, you can go ahead and jump in.
No, this is Phil. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
And Dan will pass too. I have
All right, great. Well, if there are questions when we get to that point, we're certainly happy to field those. So thanks so much.
Yeah, and thanks, Anna. And when there are questions that are directed to the MPCA, I'll just direct them to you and you can send them to the appropriate person to answer.
Sure.
Thank you. Jim or Diane from the city of Duluth, do you have any comments or anything you'd like to add before we go to a question period?
Hi, Hamilton. This is Diane Desatel. I do have a couple of comments. I just want to say that the beach area and the city's lands are very, very important to not only to our residents and our recreation, but to tourism. And we have been facing a lot of serious storms. And we also know that residents along Minnesota Point have also struggled with the impacts to their land and they actually have structures that have been threatened. We really, really appreciate the support of our partners and the strong, and we feel very professional and scientific ways that the Corps and the PCA and the DNR, even with how we have permitted and made sure that these materials are safe and will be helpful to not only the residents, but also to the beach. And we do agree that this is the first time I've seen it too, and I worked in the estuary for several years, to have seen the debris from the cans as a problem. And I'm just so pleased with the prompt and professional response that the Corps has provided to try to address this issue moving forward. We're invested to not only in the residents in the community, we're here to try to do our best to protect and try to help this area remain a little bit more resilient, at least in the short term. And we have a great opportunity here with the work that the Corps does for our economic component of shipping to be able to use these materials for the beneficial use, to be able to enjoy the recreation and hopefully protect some homesteads as a part of that. So I'll leave it at that. And if you have any questions for us, let us know.
Thank you, Diane. All right, I guess no other comments from our strategic partners. I would open it up to questions from the Erosion and High Water Committee. I will let the rest of you go first. I think I have a few scribbled down myself. Hopefully you'll ask the same questions. I won't have to ask mine. So I'll open that up to any of the community or the Erosion and High Water Committee members that would like to ask questions about the presentation or about the beach nourishment project.
Are you there?
Yes, you're on, Gary.
Gary Glass here. I was surprised by the difficulty in getting the information concerning what the project details were. And so I still have no information on exactly where did the sediments come from for the 2020 beach nourishment project. We all been guessing as to where the cans came from, and area 2 had most of the votes, not area 5. And so could you please tell us again, why are you convinced that area 2 was not a contributor to the shredded cans versus why you think area 5 was, and what evidence do you have that that's the case?
All
I guess
right.
I'm asking, or asking the core of that question.
Yeah, Hamilton, if I may.
Yes, go ahead, Melissa.
All right. So as I explained earlier, we looked at the sequence of the dredging and where that material was placed and where we were seeing the cans at when we went out there and did our monitoring. And right now, you know, by looking at those sequences, first off, area 2, we did look at that area. We only took 147 cubic yards of material out of that area and placed that over on the point. And in the area where we place that material, we're not seeing cans. So that's why we don't believe that the cans originated from area 2 or area 4.
But yet you didn't see any cans down at the south end of the point where you say you got a lot of material for that same area. So how is that?
So I didn't walk the site. I would like to turn that over to the folks out of our office that have been walking that site. I think they can provide details of where they've been finding the cans at while they were monitoring the sites. Corey or Monica, if you would, please.
Hey, this is Corey. I don't believe my webcam is working either, but a while back, and I can't remember the exact date, but we did walk the beach with, or I did walk the beach with some of the residents. And again, I know Jan Karen was one of them and kind of organized a meeting along with Hamilton and Paul and a couple others. I guess Gail was there as well. And
I was there also.
oh yeah, Gary, you were there too. And really that's where the evidence is in terms of the cans. It seemed like most of those cans were down kind of where we finished up the placement. And I know Jan even provided some photos too after the water and the waves washed things away that some of the cans were in the material, and that was more down toward the southern end of where we placed. And like Melissa said, we can backtrack that looking in our daily reports to see exactly where those dredge areas were, and the most likely one was at area 5F.
Okay, so that you would say that area 5F was also the source of the sediment for the south end of the point in 2019, correct?
There were areas, and I don't have those in front of me either. The ones that are on the presentation, obviously were the 2020 areas. I know we did do some dredging in 2019 right there in the Anchorage Basin. And that did go to the southern end of Minnesota Point. I'm talking the way south end down by Superior Entry.
I can add on to that. So Gary, just for a little bit of context, you see these dredge boxes. When we put that out in a contract, we dredge that entire box. So that area, and you can see the area adjacent to it, area 5E, which is right adjacent to 5F. We dredged that, we had no cans. In 2019, we likely dredged the area adjacent to 5F, no cans. We dredged 5A and 5B adjacent to that, placed it on interstate, no cans. So I kind of hear what you're getting at, but it's not a surprise that we dredged a similar area out of that Duluth Anchorage Basin and didn't find any cans, because In 2020, the material we dredged adjacent to 5F didn't have any cans either.
And so the sediments at the south end of Park Point are fundamentally not the same as the sediments at the north end.
I wouldn't say that. I think you've seen all the samples that characterize that material. All those we have a lot of samples in that Duluth Anchorage Basin. I can turn that over to Kevin to speak about how that sediment was characterized.
Well, we're looking for the trace contaminants as an issue. And so we've asked to see the data, and that's another part of the problem. We haven't been able to see the actual data that defines the sediments. So without that original data, we cannot answer those questions. So that's why we're asking these questions now. We haven't seen the data. We'd like to see it. We've asked for it, and we're not getting it.
I guess, Gary, I haven't seen a request from you. I know Mr. Mattson has requested it, and we're working through the formal request.
He has included my request in his request. We don't want to have to pepper you with requests. We just consolidated them to make it convenient for you.
Great.
The other part of the health advisory that we were interested in is the fact that when you have the people coming to Duluth and they are now going to be immersed in this material that they used to expect to be Park Point sand, clean from all of the storms in the lake, and now they're going to have fresh contaminated sediments. It's not a happy situation without some fundamental documentation. And so when we ask to see the contaminant concentrations in those sands and cannot get the data, we're at a point where we cannot accept the fact that it's characterized as safe and protective of the environment and of no concern for human health. That just simply doesn't wash without some verification. So that's why we're asking for the data.
Hey, Melissa and Hamilton, can I speak to that?
Yeah, please,
You
Joe.
bet.
This
Yes,
is
okay.
Joe Kreidinger. Hi. Hey, the data, certainly for the dioxins and furans, is in the human health risk assessment. And that was attached, I believe, to the email that went out. So everyone should have that, and you can look at that. And then all of the information about sediment quality is in the, the periodic sediment evaluation reports that the Corps of Engineers does. So those data are available, and we can certainly provide that information to you. And if you don't have it, I'm surprised you don't, because the state of Minnesota certainly has it as well.
Joe, that our legal is our FOIA officer is dealing with that request just because of sheer
I'll just say one other thing about the cans is when I heard about like shredded cans coming up on the beach, I checked in with my colleagues that are with the Corps of Engineers and work at a national level. It's pretty unusual to have this happen. I think it's a one-off event. And certainly if you, one way to sort of double check, about whether this is likely to ever happen again is to go over and look at Erie Pier and look at the sediment that's been placed at Erie Pier. I don't think you're going to find a lot of debris in shredded cans and that kind of material at Erie Pier. So anyway, it's pretty unusual for that particular problem to occur.
Could you check your apparatus for pumping to see whether or not they've got a blade that is capable of dicing up the debris that you usually get, to see if it would do the same for cans? So in fact, if any can comes into contact with the blade in the pumping system that is designed to do the shredding process for debris, it'll certainly shred the cans should you get cans. So I'm just curious if your pump has that type of a shredding blade device.
Hey, Gary, this is Corey. I can speak to that. And again, there's not an intention. There's not a blade or a shredder or anything intentionally in a pump. And again, based on what we've seen and just, again, assuming that these cans are from our dredge material, which obviously we're owning up to that. Basically though, once the material goes through just the pumps and impellers, or impeller, I should say, it's going to get shredded just through that operation. It's not an intentional operation. We're not purposely sending debris through. That's why there is grading on the transfer box, but it's just, I think, an unintentional shredding that took place for the cans just due to the impeller of the pump.
Well, the iron cans have really been weaponized. That's the thing that's scary. One last question on the health advisory. Would it be possible to take a few samples from the deposited material to see if in fact there are no dioxins in what you put on the beach at the north end?
I could speak to that. And what I didn't say, but rather is it's a part of our regular sediment sampling is to include dioxin and furan and PCB analysis. So these samples from the harbor itself have been analyzed for that previously. In the case of the 2019 placement, because there was greater concern about those particular contaminants and whether or not there was a human health risk, we conducted an additional analysis on top of our normal Duluth Superior Harbor sediment sampling characterization. That was to better inform how those sediments were moving into the system and whether or not potential contaminants could be transferred and what the fate of those contaminants would be. In 2019, we observed that there was, very low levels in the harbor. Those low levels potentially persisted, but were reduced during placement, and therefore they were below the screening level. In the future, in coordination with the MPCA, we will be looking at potential contaminants in the harbor sediment samples against those screening levels. If there are any sediments or samples, potential dredge areas that are above those screening levels, those sediments would not be deemed suitable for in-water placement, and therefore they wouldn't be used in restoration or beach sediment projects. So in this case, we looked at the data we already had available. None of that indicated that there was an issue or potential human health risk. Those data were further evaluated as part of our coordination with the MPCA and deemed suitable for in-water placement.
And so where might that analysis of the data be, or where might the chemical analysis for the in-harbor samples be? I haven't been able to see any of that for dioxin. Where is it located? What's
those data will be in the same reports that Joe just referenced that I believe will be included as part of the FOIA request that is pending.
Okay, so we'll finally get what we requested. Okay, thank you. But it isn't that's my question. You could still answer if you analyze a few samples just to prove that there's none there. What's the cost of doing an analysis for a dioxin sample?
Depending on the laboratory contract set up, I believe that the individual samples are on the order of hundreds of dollars per sample, but it has to be under a particular contract. I know Joe can speak to this as well, but within the federal. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Joe.
so the dioxin and furans are actually pretty expensive to run, but it's about $1,000 a sample is pretty typical.
Okay, well, we'll be looking to see if you've got any analysis that's relevant to the north placement of what's there for 2020. We got to verify what was promised.
So the data that's available is what's in the harbor.
Got it. And you say what's in the harbor goes on to the beach.
Right.
So so the analysis ought to be relevant.
Sure. But it sounded like you were expecting analysis of samples from material collected from the beach.
If you wanted to do the job properly, that's where you would take additional samples to show that the people who are living there and the visitors that are coming to sunbathe there are not going to get exposed to anything because you've got analysis.
Do you remember the discussion that the material that was placed on the south end of the beach was 100 times lower than the human health risk criteria?
I remember you saying that, and we've been looking for the data to verify it. Yes, absolutely. We're anxiously awaiting to see the data. But again, there was nothing reported in the health advisory relevant to what's in the harbor. It was all after you fiddled with putting it on the beach and washed it away or diluted it out. No starting materials were listed. I'm done asking questions because it's somebody else's turn.
Anybody else from our group got questions, please?
I don't know, this is Gordon Kearns. This is just in response to Gary. I guess I don't really understand, Gary, what you're reaching at. It seems clear to me that they tested material in the harbor and placed it on the beach. So I guess I don't understand what your concern is.
Show me the test.
Can I jump in here, Gary? So the material was tested, and somebody from MPCA can jump in here, and those test results were evaluated by the MPCA before that material was placed, correct? So the MPCA would have seen those test results that Gary is now asking for. Is that correct?
This is Anna. Maybe I can hop in here, if that's all right, Hamilton.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so there's a couple of different things at play. So the material in the harbor has been evaluated, and as was mentioned, the larger harbor sampling happens on a 3 to 5 year basis, as Melissa and Kevin from the Corps explained. The additional sampling that we did in 2020 of the 2019 placed material was done as part of the human health risk assessment. And I can speak to a couple of pieces of that, and then I will turn it over to some other MPCA folks to add more detail. But a couple things I want you to recognize is that we required this additional sampling to be done because of the exact concerns that you have, that this material is being placed in areas where people regularly recreate, where people live. And so we wanted to, verify once again that this material is appropriate for placement. And in addition to the samples that the Corps took, MPCA ponied up some money, and we actually contracted for additional sampling to be done to further verify. And so the Corps did the on-beach sampling, and PCA's contractor did the in-water sampling. And I haven't spoken to you before, Gary, so I haven't provided that directly to you, but the report from our contractor was provided to other individuals who have requested it. And we did have a Data Practices Act request received by the agency this fall. I believe it came in November, and that has been fulfilled, and the data requested shared. So if there are pieces that maybe some individuals haven't shared everything that they may have received, we certainly can share that. But I do want to also point out, as Melissa mentioned, the FOIA request is the process to get the federal information. From the state, we have what's called the Data Practices Act. And if you're requesting specific information from an agency, that is the appropriate channel to go through to request it. Sometimes staff are able to pull something quickly and pass it off. But I, as a supervisor, have to make sure that I'm, prioritizing my staff time appropriately. And so when we get a nice Data Practices Act request, it tells us exactly what it is that we're looking for, and it can be provided in a much more efficient way. That being said, I guess I'd like to see, Phil, do you have anything that you'd like to add relative to the human health risk assessment questions being raised here?
I think it's been said 2 or 3 times. I think I'm getting what the question Gary is asking. I think you just have to be. We went along with the Army Corps a little bit longer than what we usually do in terms of assessing the risk associated with these sediments. We did this, what I would call conformational sampling post-placement. And all the things that both Melissa and Kevin Meyer put out in the presentation, it showed that those concentrations even were reduced below the pre-placement samples from those dredge areas, those DMMUs that were talked about. And what's been done is then that what's laid down last year came from those same areas. So yeah, we could go out and do conformational sampling after conformational sampling. That's really not a strong way to do a risk assessment. It would be wonderful if we could do that, but you know, we don't have limitless resources, unfortunately. I mean, I hear what you're saying, Gary, definitely, and I get that from the standpoint of how do we continue to confirm what the science is showing us, and based on our sampling pre-placement. You know, I guess if we, you know, as Anna just pointed out, her group came up with some additional funds for some additional sampling. I can't speak to it. I don't hold any kind of purse strings for any of this at all. Yeah, it would be very interesting to do, but it's not necessary, I think, is what it comes down to.
Well, Phil, if you were exactly correct on the disappearance of the fines, which is what occurred in the south end, but does not appear to have been occurring on the north end because of the differences in the way the material was piled up, it retained some of those globs of the fines that have been seen and taken pictures of. We think that there's a much higher representation of the fines that contains the high dioxin in the north end than there was in the south end. And so we do have a working hypothesis and a reason for why we would like to have a few samples taken at the north end.
Can I ask you a question, Gary? What analysis do you have that those piles of fines have more dioxins in them? You're making that assumption, but I don't know. You're asking for them to show data and information. Where does yours come from?
Hamilton, that's exactly what's in the health assessment for the south end. You can read it in that text.
So and it's my understanding that none of the samples that were on the south end pre or post were above the levels of acceptable dioxins.
Right. Because they'd washed out the fines into the open waters.
On the material tested prior to being put on the beach, they were still 10 times lower than acceptable levels.
And the explanation was that the fines were washed out into the open waters.
I'm talking pre, sir, not after. I'm talking pre-placement. Was 10 times less than. Has nothing to do with fines being washed out.
They didn't do any pre-placement.
If I could clarify one thing, that during placement, there are still fines contained within the dredge material. Over time, those fines will be transported offshore as part of natural processes. That is why during our sampling of the 2019 Southern Minnesota Point, we took samples immediately during and immediately after placement was finished. That was so we could capture any potential contaminants in the fines still on the beach. We also did sampling this spring following one winter season's worth of natural processes on the beach, so that we had longevity to see how this system would change over time. In none of those samples, including the samples during and immediately post placement, when they immediately turned off the pipes, essentially, we did not find any concentrations of dioxins that were above the screening level.
Thanks for clarifying that, Kevin. I had my timing wrong. I said pre-placement. You said during at placement, so I did have my timing somewhat wrong on when the samples were taken.
It's not a problem.
So there are banks of the material that appear to be very fine that haven't been washed out yet. That's what was reported in the report by Sally Rosenfeld. So that's the material that we would think that you would want to sample just to be sure that the the dioxins were in fact reduced after placement.
Dioxins to begin with.
There's, yeah, Gary, there's no evidence that the dioxin level prior to was higher than the acceptable level. So I don't understand why you think that after placement and washing out that it's going to gain by 100-fold or whatever the number would have to be.
I'm just telling you what the report said, that they washed out the fines and the numbers went down.
Correct, but the numbers were never high enough to be an issue.
So if there,
So if you go from 10 times below acceptable level to 100 times below acceptable level, where's the problem?
that's another good question, Hamilton. Why are we fiddling with a parameter that is not higher than what's acceptable when you've got things like mercury and selenium and arsenic and maybe even some COVID-19 in that material? We should be dealing with what's really the health issues here, not just the material that it's easy to chase after. You got about 50 parameters that were questionable as whether or not this is contaminated dredge spoil. And until you pass all 50 parameters, you haven't passed go. And so by fighting with this dox and putting all your eggs in that basket, you're leaving out the fact that maybe you've got some silica in there that's going to be breathable by these kids when they suck up some of these fine particles. How are you going to answer that? You've never analyzed them.
Hamilton, can I speak to that a little bit?
Please.
So let me just say, sir, that there is no COVID-19 on the beach coming from the dredge material. Second, all sand on the beach consists of silica. And so if you're concerned about children playing on the beach and being exposed to silica, then you have a very risk adverse world that you live in, because the sand on the beach is predominantly consists of silica. So I'm not sure where you're coming from on this.
Fine breathable clay particles.
Okay, and again, every soil in Duluth has clay particles associated with it, and we all live with that soil, and it's not a hazard to human health. So again, I think you're stirring up health risks that don't exist.
If you go to slide 35, I believe that shows the list of things that are sampled for as part of our sediment evaluation. And it shows that selenium and arsenic and copper and mercury are all on the list of things that are part of our regular sampling and analysis of the sediments.
And we're going to be very happy to see them when we see them.
So Gary, when you say that, so to me, it gets down to a point where, you know, the Corps of Engineers did their scientific study on the core samples in what are they, DMMUs, whatever. And then that goes on to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that oversees that and okays it. So it gets down to, you know, the Corps did what they were supposed to do. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency said, yes, the sampling you did and the analysis you did meets all of our standards. So at this point, you know, I know you don't see the analysis. I don't think I would understand the analysis. To me, it gets down to who do we trust? Do we trust the Corps to do what they say they're doing? Do we trust the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, which is the overlooking agency from the state that's supposed to be protecting our health and our environment? Do we trust them to do their job and okay this material for beach placement? To me, that's what the question is. And in my mind, I know what my answer is, but everybody has to make up their own mind.
Go to the health department and ask them if they like the health risk assessment. You need a peer review, Hamilton.
What's that?
You would benefit by a peer review.
Me personally?
The report analysis, peer review.
Gary, we've been dealing with this for several months. It's the first time I hear you bring this up. Where are all these things coming from at the last minute?
Hamilton, can I speak to that peer review comment, please?
Please. I'm way over my head anyway.
So, well, I just want to bring up the fact, and as you mentioned, Hamilton, the Pollution Control Agency is tasked with the protection of human health and the environment. We take that very seriously. We also have very knowledgeable staff who are reviewing this information. So there is a level of peer review that is happening on a scientific level, and we are ensuring that appropriate scientific methods are used to collect, analyze, and interpret the data. And there's a large amount of QA/QC that goes into this. So I would like to just point out that the individuals working for the Corps, working for our agency, the contractors who we've hired to analyze the samples that we had collected, all of those individuals are professionals in this field, and we do have to have a level of trust that they're doing their job appropriately. And so I just like to reiterate that there is peer review and there are scientific processes very much in place associated with this project.
It sounds like your authors are well-trained, and we're very appreciative of that. That doesn't stop it from being reviewed by the people that are not connected with the project. Called unbiased peer review.
Any other members have questions or comments, please? Members of the Erosion and High Water Committee?
Yeah, Hamilton, it's Don Buck, and I've been, I remember that meeting in January of 2019, and I guess I heard it mentioned earlier. I was wondering, you know, we heard about those things that have been measured, the dioxin, the furan, the PCB. Aren't there, I remember at that meeting that they did mention that the dredge materials would be tested for heavy metals as well before they would be deposited onto the beach. Are you not measuring for that anymore? Is that standard changed? And I guess I'm looking for the people who watch over us, like you mentioned, Hamilton. As a PCA, are you fully satisfied with the project that at the north end that happened last summer, MPCA? So I guess those are my two questions. Are we not screening for anything else besides these three parameters? And is the MPCA totally satisfied with the overseeing of this project by the Corps of Engineers? I guess that's my questions I've heard from the neighborhood. And I guess I wanted to say also, Diane DeSatel mentioned it. I mean, this lake is our treasure here in Duluth. Many people on Park Point are stewards of that lake. And I guess we want to say we want to do our absolute best when we're dealing with our absolute valued treasure. So thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise in this area for us. I appreciate it.
Don, I appreciate you and your dad and their comments, but if you go to this page 35, it lists, looks about 20 or so different things that are tested for.
Just remember in January of 2019, they mentioned other things that I'm seeing right here. And these are the questions that have come from people out in the community. So it has nothing to do with Gary's questions. This is my own questions I've had from the neighborhood.
Which heavy metals are you looking for?
Pardon me?
Which heavy metals are you looking for?
Mercury, the things that they talk about in the fish, that people shouldn't eat so many fish.
It says they test for it on page 35. Right. Mercury, arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, copper, iron, lead.
I guess my question is for the MPCA and the Corps, aren't those, when they came to our meeting, they said, hey, we're going to measure in our samples, we're going to measure for these things, and are they not relevant to what goes on the beach? I guess, are they not relevant? Is that's why they weren't measured for this application?
It just says they regularly sample for these things, these 20 different things. It says that they do it every 3 to 5 years in every area. They sample for them.
But I guess I'm not seeing it in terms of what's going on the beach.
If I could speak to that. So
what's going on the beach is what they test in the harbor.
I guess my questions are for the Kevins, and I thank you, Kevins, for being here to answer the question.
It's not a problem. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. So if I'm understanding the question right, with respect to what we talked about in the 2019 placement, where we did the additional sampling on the beach and the human health risk assessment, that focused on dioxins and furans, and you're correct. However, this whole list on page 35 that is now displaying on the screen, we also look at each and every one of those. So the mercuries, the leads, we look at what levels there may be, if any, in all of our harbor samples. Okay. And in this case, none of those were at levels that were any concern. And many of them are already very well described in terms of toxicity and how they move through the food web, or can be, incorporated by humans or human exposure. So we were specifically focused on the dioxins and furans to better characterize the human exposure and the risk to humans because it was more of an unknown. And we wanted to make sure that we had extra verification that those chemicals in particular were not going to be a concern. The others were evaluated as part of our regular evaluation in coordination with the MPCA, and they were not of concern based on what we already knew about these chemicals and what we already understood about their risk and their exposure to humans.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much, Kevin.
And if Hamilton, if I could follow that up too,
Please.
I would add to what Kevin Meyer just said. I think that's a good segue to explain what triggered the need for the human health risk assessment to begin with. And it was because when the Corps makes a submittal to the PCA for 401 certification for placing dredged material, in their submittal, they identify what is in the sediment that's going to be dredged. That's just required. And the Corps knows it, and they have taken the samples and they have the analysis and they provide that in their submittal to us. And for 2019, where we were, my involvement in the AOC dates back to about 2015, roughly, in terms of the 401 certifications for like the 21st Avenue and 40th Avenue projects, Interstate Island, the habitat restoration. Those projects were to place the sediment back into the water, and a lot of scientists had reviewed the it's referred to as the QAP, quality assurance. Other people on this call can help me out with that acronym. I know Joe Creighton, Jerkin, or Phil.
Project plan.
Thank you. Quality assurance project plan. And so there's that level of review, and there's criteria in that document. But what happened when we got the proposal in 2019, and yep, we worked closely with the Corps, and we all aware of the erosion that's happening along Park Point, was, hey, we are looking to place it along Park Point. And Phil Munson, my go-to scientist, when I receive submittals with the sediment samples and the scientific analysis, I know enough about how to work my way through those documents, and I've seen several sediment profiles. And so they're really characterizing, the actual sediment that will be dredged. And what caught our eye at that time, so you've got the screen in front of us here with the things that are typically tested for. And we noticed that the dioxin said, okay, now we're talking about putting this on a beach now where there's a lot of human interaction. And Phil and I sat down and we talked about this, and we recommended to our management that we think this requires a human health risk assessment to be sure of this. And that is what triggered the need for the human health risk assessment. That is why, Don, we kind of, our conversation has seemingly focused more on the dioxins, I think, anyhow, because of that history. But then, the human health risk assessment, which followed EPA federal criteria, and the Corps and PCA worked extensively on making sure the methods were being used appropriately. And that's what led to the data, the conclusions that Kevin Meyer has just presented, that it sounds like the Corps is on its way to providing to Gary. So just wanted to provide that context a little bit better in terms of why we even required the human health risk assessment.
All right, thank you, Kevin. both Kevin M's.
Sure.
Any other questions from our Erosion High Water Committee members?
Yes, I'm Paul Troyer. Thank you for the information. It's really helpful. A really simple question. How will we know that the shredded cans, and I've walked the beach, and there's some pieces that are really large and some really small pieces. How are we going to know that it's safe for people to go on the beach? What monitoring, what testing will be done to demonstrate that once in a lifetime mistake that happened this year is literally cleaned up?
I can speak to that, Paul. This is Melissa Bosman from the Corps. Right now, our area office is going to be sending people out on site twice a week to monitor that site, monitor the debris, clean up anything that they're seeing, with a focus on that shredded aluminum cans. And we're going to continue to be out there picking up that debris and monitoring it until we don't see anymore and we don't feel that there's a need to be out there. So we're going to be providing reports, or I shouldn't say a report, a summary of what we're finding on probably every 2 weeks to the Park Point Community Club. And it'll be posted on that website so folks in the community can kind of look and see what we're finding and get an update on our sampling, our collection efforts.
So the monitoring will just be visual. So
yes, correct. We looked at a couple different ways, things to go out there and be able to basically clean that beach. We talked to a few beach groomers. They don't really have equipment that can go out there and basically rake the beach for particles as small as those pieces of aluminum. And you can't use magnets to pick it up, obviously. So I think right now, the best that we can do is go out there and look for those pieces and pick them up physically.
Paul, do you have other questions? Paul, Drew, you said you had simple questions. Is that it?
I don't think he can hear you.
Yeah, Paul, we're not hearing you. Are you speaking or no?
Oh, yeah, I have no more questions.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
I will add that, Mondays and Wednesdays, the Corps of Engineers has been patrolling the beach, and will do that after thaw out. Gail Kearns has offered to take Tuesdays. He lives in that area. I've offered to take Thursdays. I walk down to the beach at my house at 16th and to the bridge. So if there's any other volunteers that'd like to take the other 3 days of the week, we're more than happy to accommodate them once we have thaw. No one knows how long, this monitoring and patrolling is going to take. Hopefully that it's not a years, it's going to go on for years, but I guess we don't know how long those shredded pieces of material are going to come up. I do have one question on that topic to the city of Duluth. We made a recommendation or a request for signage to be put at beach access areas from the bridge to 16th, advising people of the shredded cans and material on the beach, and a warning for them to be careful of themselves, bare feet, their dogs, whatever. If Diane or whoever would like to answer, have we gotten anywhere on that request? Diane, are you still here?
I am still here. I was giving a pause because I wasn't sure if Jim wanted to comment.
Okay.
We have heard that request. I don't have any further information for you on that. But I will check on that and follow up with you, Hamilton, on that idea. I have not heard from management about that yet. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you on that.
Okay, I mean, we have a couple of months here, but obviously we'd like those signs to go up before things start to thaw.
I'll check on that. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you. So Melissa or someone, you know, so when I'm looking at the analysis of the sediment samples from 2020 compared to 2021, it seems to me that if you were to take the total composition of fines to coarse sand in the 2020 dredge areas placed on Park Point and the proposed mixed of those sediments for 2021, that we're getting a lot better material as far as coarse compared to fines, or is that true, Melissa?
Yeah.
Or whoever did that sediment analysis?
Right. I can speak to overall in that Eastgate Basin, the lower level, the B layer, C layer, D layer, our sediment samples that we have in that location show that the grain size characteristic is around 94 to 97% overall in that area. So yes, I would say that that material from the Eastgate Basin will have a lot more sand in it than fines compared to the 2020 material. I guess I would ask Kevin Meyer, our biologist, who really knows the sediment, to kind of weigh in on that and correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that's accurate, where you are going to see a higher proportion of sand relative to the 2020 material. From a quality perspective, that those sediments that we're proposing for this year undergo the same scrutiny that all other sediments do. And so, it is going to get that same level of review by the Army Corps and the MPCA prior to any approvals or any actual placement underway. Just based on a sediment size characterization, Melissa hit it on the head that it is going to be more sand than compared to 2020.
My remembrance is we were in the 84 to 87% sand compared to fines in the 2020 sampling. I don't have that. I got a lot of pieces of paper in front of me here, but that's not one of them.
That's definitely in the ballpark. It was the high 80s in terms of sand for the 2020 material. That is correct.
Thank you. That's what I remember. All right. I think if I can read my scribbling here, I think I've had most of my questions answered. So at this point, I guess we would like to turn this over to any members of the public who have questions or comments. We've already been going here for quite a while, so I will be even more asking for people to limit their questions and comments to their 3 minutes, but I'm certainly going to open it up. I think, Dawn, you can probably, I don't know if you have to, if anybody can just jump in by unmuting themselves, or do you have to, or you do have to let them in, Dawn?
No, they can speak up at their leisure here.
All right, sounds very good. I will mute myself, and anybody from the public that has questions or comments, please chime in.
This is Ted Buck. keep it all in the family, I guess. I just have first I want to thank everybody for this presentations, and it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of information. I have two questions, and I guess one of them was if the cans were a surprise and it's something that wasn't seen in the samples and was just not expected. I understand like Gary's skepticism about what else is out there. And I guess also I'm wondering why the contractors or the Corps or somebody else didn't bring up the cans. It had to be residents. I went down and walked and collected a couple of bags worth of these things, but that the Corps didn't see it, that the contractor didn't see it, and that it was like a surprise. Can someone address why that was a surprise?
I think I can speak to why it was a surprise from the course standpoint. You know, like I said during the presentation, we placed over 1.1 million cubic yards of material. You know, we're used to seeing maybe some organic material, maybe you know, some shredded wood in that material. We've never seen cans. So when that contractor was out there placing that material, they did see a can here and there, but if you look at all the other debris that we're finding out there, you know, we had no way of, you know, assuming that it was from our placement operations when you look at all the other debris that's out there on Minnesota Point. So never once did it cross our mind that it was coming from our dredge operations. This is the first time that we've encountered cans. So it was as much of a surprise to us as I'm sure it was to you guys. And once, you know, I think when it went through that pump, there were pieces that were buried, it's coming out in a slurry, and that material is getting worked around with a dozer. So you're not necessarily seeing those pieces, they're being buried. And it's not until that material moves around that they get exposed.
You know
and we placed that material at the end of placement.
No.
So that contractor was gone by the time that material started working around and people were seeing it and notifying us. I would ask Corey or Monica to weigh in on that if you guys see anything different from being out there in the field.
Hey, this is Corey again, and Melissa hit that question. Some of the things that we observed too. Obviously, like I said, the contractor does have a grading on their transfer box. And you guys could probably, or maybe you did see that transfer box over near our vessel yard near 9th Street, where the material was being put into the box, and then that put it in a slurry and then it transferred over. But there's a grading there, so if there was debris or large debris, then that is collected. Obviously, when you do mix it up and it's all in a clump, it's tough to tell. You know, I spent some time with Monica talking through this too. It's tough to tell the difference between, you know, a debris versus a chunk of wood. And same thing too, like Melissa said, if they did happen to make it through the grading and went through the pump and went into these small pieces, you know, the material, it's like taking it's spraying out. Obviously it's hitting a baffle plate, but there's a lot of activity, a lot of movement, and we just were not seeing a whole lot of cans. I will say too that at the end, we did notice, the contractor did notice some cans at the very end, and this is like when their final grading was done, and that's something that at that time we addressed. We just thought, oh, this is just some random cans. So it was collected at that time. I know Monica spent, you know, a few hours an afternoon with the contractor just cleaning up whatever there, but it wasn't a huge amount. So again, I think it was tough to see that stuff just because it was such a dynamic area.
If I could step in, this is Andrew Slade, neighbor of the beach, and very involved with, especially the you know, looking at and monitoring the cans afterwards. I think it ties in with what people were talking about. First of all, I'm really pleased to see the 2021 quality of the sand that's being proposed. The deposition will happen right outside our house, so it'd be great to have the coarser sand there. But you know, this placement compared to like an interstate island or compared to 21st Avenue West, or this is getting a lot of eyes, a lot of feet on the ground. You know, I walk that beach twice a day, every day with my dog on my way to work. Lots of people are down there. I think it's getting, one of the reasons you might be seeing more cans showing up there is just because there's 10 times, 20 times as many eyes on the ground as there are in other other places where placement has happened. But I want to put a caution into the work that's happening with that Melissa referred to. Like, well, are people only found cans in a certain 200-yard stretch or 200-foot stretch, and that correlates back to Area 5F based on the diary? I can tell you that the places where the cans weren't found during that search, cans weren't there because we picked them up. We had a lot of people out picking up the cans on the beach. I know from my own experience, there are cans emerging from the sediment all the way up and down at an almost equal rate. So the idea that it was only one area, I don't think you're getting quality information to be able to track back that one area where some cans are found back to one dredge area. I think it's because again, the cans, and I can even see under the ice now, can find places where cans are emerging from the matrix all the way up and down the beach. So I think it's just important to the extent that it's important to do the historical detective work and find out where those cans came from. I don't think that's a very reliable data set about it. It was just that 200 foot of sand. It was really the whole thing. The cans have been emerging as the sediment gets reworked. It's no surprise that when they first laid it out, they didn't see it. We didn't see it. But after a windstorm, after a small wave set coming in, those cans were continuing to emerge. Every time there's a bit of a wind blowing dry sediment on the top, every time there's a bit of wave action working up there, the cans were continuing to emerge. So I have no reason to believe that they're not all through that whole matrix of sand, up, down 5 feet or 20 feet, however far, however deep it is. I think we need to plan, as a contingency at least, that these cans are going to continue to emerge. I'm hoping that this new quality sources, the dredge sources that Melissa was mentioning, she said, we are more confident that there's not as much debris in there. It'd be great to find a way to ground truth that as we get into it in the summer, because once these cans are deposited into the matrix of the beach, it's going to take years for them to re-emerge. I would just follow up on Gary Glass's comments about trying to shred the cans as they're deposited. I think that's a bad idea. These are really sharp things. I've peeled them out of my dog's claws. Fortunately, it wasn't really barefoot season when we were out there, but we don't want any at all, would be best. But to shred them even smaller, I think is just asking for more problems. So
I didn't say to shred the cans. I didn't say anything about shredding cans, but you could use a magnet to pick up the metal, the iron ones. So from that perspective, iron is present in a lot of the metal ones, the beer can.
Yeah, there were some old pull tabs. And then the other thing I just mentioned based on observation is that these are cans from a 20-year time period. There's everywhere from really old-fashioned cans to pretty modern ones with the pop tops. And so it's we could see some. I could show you pictures of like cans from the 1970s if you want. Cans from I was still hoping for some Billy beer cans, but didn't get any of those.
Yeah, that's 50 years old in 70s. So
yeah. And I would also, just as long as I'm talking, I had one more sort of related point. We have not seen this project really challenged by a real fall storm. We made it through this fall of 2020 without any real storms. We really don't know the efficacy of these in terms of what's going to stand up. I can show you a couple places where the waves are already cutting pretty close to even in the deposited area, where they don't seem to have been real effective in terms of keeping the wash all the way from the end of the dunes. I would just like to put out there the possibility of we wait a year for the next round of deposition. I know the plans are in process, but if there's any way to give this initial project a year to sit and prove out, that would help address that.
Hamilton, may I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
So Andrew, when you say are you speaking to like the longevity of the of how long the beach nourishment will last. I guess I'm a little confused about your last comment there. And if that's what you're speaking to, I mean, I think it's a well-known and well talked about fact that this is not a long-term solution for erosion control, right? This is, we're putting kind of a Band-Aid on this and trying to do what we can to protect property here, but it certainly is not the long-term solution to the erosion along the point. So please know that we do understand that exists.
Yeah, I just, to me, I have my own theories about what the natural beach would have been. And the theories include, like, this is not where we're at. This is not the natural materials that we should have here anyways. So my concern is just that it's not even worth doing what we're doing. That, if with a good fall storm or two, especially with the amount of fines in the material, we may lose 50% or 75% of the material that's out there. We just don't know.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to be clear that I understood what the point you were making. So thanks for that.
Anyone else from the public that has comments or questions? Thank you, Andrew. By the way, that was a pretty good analysis of the migration of the metal. I've been walking from 16th down, and I have found shredded cans, which I would not attribute to normal beach trash, as in the 1300 block on my walk down. So it does that material is migrating. Since we stopped at 9th, it's obviously migrating both directions, I would assume, from where the material that contained the cans was placed.
Hamilton, may I make one statement, please? I guess what I meant to say about our assessment of these cans is there's a higher density of cans found in the area where we place the 5. We understand that through coastal processes, this sand's gonna migrate, and it depends on the winds and the waves. So we understand that those cans have spread north and south on the point, but when we look at the higher density that we're seeing these cans, it appears to be more in that area where that 5F was placed. Thank you.
Where is that? Could you say, Melissa, where was the 5F placed?
Down by, and Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, down by between 9th and 10th Street, I believe.
So at the very end of the nourishment.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I believe in our walk and our beach walk and what the information I've gotten from others that have done beach walks. I think in that 8, 7, the 8th to 9th area is probably where the most cans have been found. Typical migration in that area is south. So if you were to find things in 9, 10, it would seem pretty logical if they were placed at the 800 block. So, but like I said, I found cans as far down as 13th that were very shredded up. I could not attribute that to somebody just throwing their can on the beach. So they can migrate a pretty good distance. So anyone else?
No, this is Ted Buck again. I walked, I think the day after Hamilton, you walked with the Corps and picking up cans, and then also, and I have a little video of some shards in the surf, and you can see how mobile, because as you pointed out, Melissa, it's non-ferrous and it's so light that it just a very light wave action was able to move those shards of shredded aluminum up and down the beach. So I think we'll probably be seeing those little shards depending on the wind, all along the beach.
Did you find any on your beach? How far south did you find those shards? Do you remember?
Oh man, I'll have to consult with Dawn. She's got a better sense of where I was. I was more of sense of trying to pick them up because I was
it's hard
so intrigued. But like I said, I just found like maybe like 1 square inch. I have a little video of it I took because I didn't want to get cold and wet, because I watched it just moving around in the water and how it was how mobile it was. I was really surprised.
Yeah, I'm sure
like it sinks to the bottom and stays.
I also walked from 16th down to 22nd a couple of times. I was unable in those couple of walks before freeze up to find any of that shredded aluminum in that area. Not saying that in time that some can't migrate there, but I didn't find any in that area in my 2 walks where I was looking before freeze up. So, but I did find them on 16th going down towards the bridge. So good. Anybody else? I don't think anybody's going to be too upset if this meeting adjourns before long.
Hamilton, could I make one comment, please, before we stop?
Absolutely, Anna.
This is Gail Tofty.
Oh, hi.
I am on the area that we're discussing, and I'd first like to thank all the coordinated efforts that have been put forward for the effort to make an increased beach in front of us. I've observed some of the same things that everybody else has. I walk the beach frequently. I'm going to accept the fact that it was a once in a lifetime experience that this happened. I'm sorry that this was the result, because I'm thrilled to think that we are the recipients of some of the dredge materials. I want them to be good. I want it to be a safe place to walk, to experience. But I do want to express my appreciation for all the efforts that are being made. I want to make sure that that when the project coordinators return to the area, that they look at how thin in the last, I would say, the 800 and particularly in the 900 block, the deposit I thought was very slim compared to the area immediately after the canal. And I hope that they will, I'd like to go on record to say to pay very close attention to the where they should begin to place the dredge materials that will be available in 2021, and hope that they will back up a little bit and not just start at the exact point where they left off, because they were running pretty slim that last couple hundred yards. And thank you for providing the forum for us to get together and talk about this. And I'm going to volunteer to be one of those people to go out and pick up cans.
You're my new favorite person.
Hamilton, this is Diane with the city. I just want to thank the residents sincerely for helping out to keep our land safe and helping us work through this situation together. And keep us posted on what you find along with the Corps, so that we can continue to try to correct as best we can what happened. And hopefully, as Gail said, we're moving forward and we'll have a much more positive outcome with the next round.
Melissa, going to Gail's question, I think this is a topic, one of many that you and I discussed in our, thank you for your vacation time on December 30th, by the way. I took 2 hours and 40 minutes of Melissa's vacation time on December 30th. But we discussed this overlapping from last year's beach nourishment to this year's, did we not?
We did, Hamilton, and I think we would like to coordinate with the community, with the city, to expand that the placement site for 2021 to overlap, just in case that material is migrated. Right now, we're looking at 100,000 cubic yards, so I think we would still have plenty to be able to make it down to 12th Street. Our engineers would definitely do an assessment to make sure that that's the case, but certainly I think that is a good possibility that we would be able to overlap that dredge placement area.
Thank you. Other comments or questions?
Just one, Hamilton, on the limitation. You need to go to 12th and a half or 13th Street in order to protect the city's walkway that they've recently installed, because that's sustained an area where it's eroded away. So you do need to get to 13th.
The material will go as far, it didn't go as far this year as was predicted, if you remember right. So I don't know how much control we have over, we know how much material we're going to get. I don't know that we know exactly how far it's going to go.
Well, just get some more.
There's always that. There's always that. I don't know if it's as hard next in 2022 as it was in 2021. I may let somebody else do it. So, any other questions or comments? Wonderful. If that's all, I would like to say thank you, and thank you, especially Melissa and Anna for putting together their teams. I know I spent a lot of time on the phone with both of them, especially Melissa. She probably knows a lot more about me than most of you do by now. So we had a lot of good conversations, having vacation in some of the same areas in Michigan, other than talking about the beach nourishment. And she gave me a lot of hours of her vacation time in the end of December too, which I apologize for probably the fourth time, Melissa. I think I've apologized for that. At that point, I thank you, everyone. I hope that everybody got most, if not all, of their questions and concerns answered. There were certain things that came up, especially when I was first talking to Melissa, that raised my eyebrows, and that's why I inquisitioned her for such a long time. But she did have good answers, and it was my misunderstanding was probably more important to that issue than the reality of it. So at that point, if there's anybody else wants to make a comment from our committee, I would certainly listen to that. Otherwise, I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
I second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Good
Very
night.
good.
And
Thank you.
all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for coming.
Everyone.
Thank you, Hamilton and the community. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank
Thank you. Have a nice
Thank you,
evening.
everyone, for organizing and participating. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.